This is not a podcast for comfort. It's a podcast for clarity. In a culture flooded with noise, dangerous narratives, and emotional uncertainty, this space exists to examine what actually matters and what actually works. Here we question power itself, belief systems, and the assumptions most people inherit without inspection. Most people accept instead of dissect. This podcast is about correcting that. Welcome. Bienvenue. Welcome. Marhaban. Bienvenidos to the Magnificent Ones podcast.
30 years ago, if you walked into a commercial airline cockpit, the odds of seeing a woman in command were almost non-existent. Even today, women make up only about 5% of airline pilots worldwide. Now narrow that further. Military aviation, combat-era environments, high-stakes command decisions, long-haul operational thinking. The percentage becomes microscopic. Then narrow it again. A woman raised inside a closed, old-order Mennonite community where silence was expected, obedience was taught, and leadership was not part of the script. The probability becomes even smaller. Yet today's guest lived that entire arc, from a closed system to the U.S. Air Force, to flying during the Gulf War, to nearly 3 decades in commercial aviation, eventually commanding a Boeing 777, one of the most complex aircraft ever built. And when you're thousands of miles from land, when something fails, when there's no easy answer, clarity isn't philosophical, it's operational. This is the Magnificent Ones. And today's conversation is about clarity under pressure, how it's built, how it holds, and why clarity, not confidence, may be the most important meta skill for navigating modern life.
Patty, my first question for you is, when did you realize that clarity, not confidence, was the real skill that kept you alive in the cockpit?
That's a great question. When is the first? Gosh, that's a hard question to answer. Because it's a hard question to answer because you do so much training around emergency situations, which are developing clarity. And so I guess I'm kind of and also because the process of developing clarity is something that I have sort of been developing all of my life. I guess what I would say is this in terms of aviation is that aviation is there are a few other professions, but aviation is a unique industry being a pilot is a unique exercise or laboratory, however you want to think about it, in the costs of not having clarity. It is always present. One of the phrases that I use in one of my books is the ground doesn't care. And it doesn't care whether you had a bad day. It doesn't care whether you were up all night caring for a sick child. It doesn't care whether you just broke up with your boyfriend or girlfriend. The ground is always there. And so you had better get your mind in the game and you better stay clear. And if you're not clear, to recognize that you're not clear and catch up, something we call in aviation a chain of errors. So I guess the answer is I can't think of any one specific story where I was like, oh my gosh, it's ever present. And so I have taken that into other parts of my life as well. And that recognition has been helpful in every other part of life.
Something that I've recognized with talking to lots of individuals is that you'll have individuals that are highly skilled, that they pay close attention to detail, and they've had no errors occur because they've been so detail oriented, right? And so they haven't dealt with an instance where things went wrong because they've always been doing things right. And then the moment finally happens when something goes wrong that was not in their control, and it wasn't because of a miscalculation on their part. And so it's almost like a double-edged sword because you need certain things to allow you to adapt and to evolve. And experience, as they say, is the greatest teacher. Have you encountered a situation where things went right for so long and then finally it just did not? And it wasn't on your part, it just happened.
Yeah, so this is out. So in aviation, that doesn't happen very often. We have a saying, there's no such thing as a perfect flight. And so it's a very dynamic environment. You're always affected by things outside of you. You're affected by weather, you're affected by winds, you're affected by other crew members you fly with, the airplane malfunctions. So for me, that's less likely the idea, oh, I can be so prepared that nothing will go wrong. The airplane can break. That's just a fact of life. But where I can think of one instance where it has come up in a personal relationship where you're doing everything right, like you're operating with integrity, you're being generous, being understanding, and the other person behaves badly, behaves out of integrity. You can't change that. And it catches you off guard. And then part of what you can do as it relates to clarity is you can deny it because you don't want to see it. It's something called betrayal blindness, right? And you can downplay it, you can minimize it, you can excuse it, you can do all kinds of different things. You can confront it, but no matter how much you prepare, other people can behave badly towards you. Things can break, things happen. And it's your ability to have clarity about what is this? How am I seeing this clearly? Like, is this what's happening? And then what are my choices? What are my choices? And sometimes people jump right from this is what's happening to a reaction. And you want to take a moment to stop and think about what are the range of my choices? And now what am I going to choose?
How did aviation help you understand how to separate signal from noise? And what are the difference between the two?
Well, signal from noise started when I was a very young child. And this may be a little off base, but I think it's relevant to what we're talking about. And then I'll get back to the aviation example. But from a very young age, I navigated my life by something that I call the call of the wild soul. And I had experiences as a young child of guidance that I didn't know what it meant. It just had a ring of integrity, and it wasn't authoritarian. It wasn't go do this. It was just, and so I have always kind of lived my life with that. It's like it's a tuning fork, and I can hear the level of integrity or the level of quality of advice or information or clarity. It doesn't mean that I never make mistakes. It doesn't mean I'm never fooled. But that attention to that has been there since I was a child. So in the airplane, the difference between signal and noise. So part of it in the airplane, part of it is being humble. So in terms of any experienced pilot will tell you, even the best pilot, even the absolute ace of the base, the person who does check rides, the person who instructs other people, you can overload them. You can have so many things going on at once. There can be so much noise that they can't hear the signal, and anyone can get overloaded. And then the thing is to recognize that that's a possibility, and to start, you have to start shedding things. You have to prioritize. You have to say, this isn't important right now in this moment. What's important right now in this moment is getting on the ground with this engine on fire, or whatever it is that you're handling. And you sort of have to build those compartmentalizations in your brain.
So can you take us to one specific moment? You're in command, something goes wrong, you're far from diversion airports, the crew is looking at you, the passengers are unaware, time is compressing. Now, what happened, and what did you see first, and what went through your mind, and what decision did you make?
So, with the when I upgraded to the left seat in the airlines, I was an aircraft commander in the Air Force. But when you go into the airlines, you start over at the bottom. You're a first officer, co-pilot, and then you upgrade. So when I upgraded to the left seat to captain, it was on the 757, 767 fleet. And I'd finished. The way it works is you go through all your training, you learn systems, and you go through all your emergency procedures, and you practice in the simulator, and then you have to pass a check ride. And then when you go out on the line, you're flying people, you go with a line check airman, so an instructor pilot who checks you out and either signs you off or don't. And then you have to also go out with an FAA representative on one of the flights. Well, I was with the line check airman, and I had flown with her when she was a captain. And so we were sitting there, we were going, I can't remember, we were going somewhere in the East Coast to Denver. And this light came on that in the 757 is kind of a warning light. So most warning lights are like, you look stuff up and you get it to go out. This warning light in the 757, you look at it and you're like, probably going to be shutting down the engine, right? So, excuse me. So I saw it come on. I was like, so a quick moment for a joke, because in the airplane, one of the things you want to do is take your time. So I just looked at her and I said, "Oh, come on." I said, "I did all this stuff in the simulator. We don't really have to do this again, right?" So just a quick joke. Then we get out the checklist and we pull it back, and sure enough, we do have to shut it down. And then as soon as you shut down an engine, you have to divert into somewhere. And it's a time where you're thinking about what your options are, and you're thinking about the people in the back. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about after we do all the checklist items and take care of the airplane is I'm thinking, okay, so you have to tell the people in the back you're diverting. You also have to think about, how did these people feel about having lost an engine? As a pilot, I know the airplane can fly on perfectly good on one engine, but a lot of people in the back who aren't familiar with aviation are probably going to be like, we're going to die. And so I just worked that into my announcement. I said, we lost an engine. We're going to have to divert to Denver Airport. No, it wasn't Denver. It was Kansas City. We're going to have to divert. And I said, but the airplane can fly perfectly well on one engine, so you don't need to worry. And so you just think about all the different considerations there.
Because I think that moment, for me personally, I think that probably most human beings, where they're not trained in a situation, it becomes a survival situation emotionally. Not that it is, but emotionally, our emotions can, take the better of us, right? Because you're like, oh, I've watched every movie in the world where this is what happens, and it's not reality. And because you have that lived experience and being able to say that, I'm sure you were calm when you said that, and that was probably a comfort to those people as well.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I think, one of the things is that you get trained in aviation, and I'm sure this is this way in medicine if you're a surgeon or something. You get trained to take the emotion out of it simply by going over it, by being so well prepared, right? And then I have always been, for whatever reason, I can get in my head when there's not pressure, but when there's pressure, I forget all about it. I'm like, what needs to be done? And my mind is busy, and then there's not fear. It's just, this is a decision that has to be made. What are we going to do? That sort of thing.
So how does that apply to your everyday life? Like that type of thinking?
So how does that apply to everyday life? Taking the emotion out of it?
Yeah.
So I think it's harder sometimes to do up close and personal in things that do involve emotion, right? So the airplane, aside from thinking about how the passengers are going to feel about it, emotion doesn't really come into it except what you bring into the equation, right? If you bring in, you're having a bad day, and that's valid to notice that. But the airplane doesn't need your emotion. In human relationships, it does come into play in terms of we are affected by the people closest to us. And so the training in aviation, what I have been working on lately or over the last couple of years, is to use emotion as information. I think we can get confused between whether feelings are facts, right? They're not. They're information for us. They tell us something about our internal world, something about what we're registering. And so what I try to separate from for myself is, well, what's actually happening? Factually, what has happened? And then not make my feelings wrong, but try not to bring them into the conversation then. That they are reserved simply as information for myself for the most part. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I'm not giving anybody advice to do that. I'm just saying this is what I have come to find I like that works better for me.
In an area that I've often made mistakes is I'll just be factual in situations. And I think because I'll compartmentalize and I'll say, let's slow down and let's dissect this. And I think that's not an approach that most people are used to, that it would make me out to be almost like a villain. Not that that was my intention. So I had to learn to bring more emotion, like not just listening, because there's almost this temptation to, okay, well, this is what you said. I listened and now it's my turn to talk. And it's like, okay, let's stay here on this point and then we'll move to the next point. And for a lot of people, because emotions, it's like this thing that goes in multiple directions. When you're being linear and chronological, a lot of people don't operate that way. And so they don't necessarily know how to respond to that.
That's a really good point. And to be completely emotionless or to not acknowledge other people's emotions is not an aim point, I think.
Mhm.
For me, it's just about what do I want to be running the show? What do I want to be in the foreground? And who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But I think it's a good point. Sometimes emotions helpful information. You can be happy for people. You can express yourself. And I think, but probably one of the most important things is to not invalidate other people's emotions. Doesn't necessarily have to mean that feeling is a fact. It's just, it's where they are, and to validate for them, and to not be so uncomfortable with the emotion that you can't stay in the room with them. You can't be there with them.
Mhm. I think, and to a large extent, most of my life, it was, let's be factual. And not because my intent, they talk about intent versus outcome. My intent was to show that I am actually listening actively and that I'm slowing down and not reacting. That's dating wise that didn't always land well.
Isn't it so funny? We have to, even if something is functional in one way, there's so much we have to unlearn. There's so much conditioning. And it's not one size fits all for everybody. Like, it's like, I have to learn to show emotion, or I have to learn to not show emotion. And, but part of that is because you're looking at impact. How is this impacting other people? How are they receiving this? And so maybe I need to adjust my delivery in what
Yeah.
I show. Yeah.
I think in many ways, people don't realize how uncertain so many things are. Even us, right? Our brains can lie to us, and when we're called out, it's almost an identity shift may occur, because if you're willing and able to accept that, and you're like, okay, I didn't realize that I was negatively impacting other people and unintentionally invalidating their feelings by my approach. And so when I changed that, my identity also shifted as well, because I learned that I'm processing information, but how I'm processing the information, I need to now also process and translate the emotion to then match who I'm speaking to.
Yeah.
And that was a skill that I learned in painful ways, because my friends growing up, they would always tell me that in certain situations, they felt like I was a robot. Dating
Mm.
two separate levels of relationships, right? Dating wise, they're like, you're fun in all these situations, but when it comes to to high emotional situations, it's like you're a robot. You're giving inputs and outputs. And, but that was always how I functioned. And then I realized that, well, not everyone operates this way. So I have to be more, I guess, human, right? And be relatable in those emotional moments, because just because I have control over my emotions, it's not necessarily about the control. It's the vulnerability of saying, I'm also affected by the things that you're telling me. People want to be not just seen and heard, but they also want to know that you feel, and I think not everyone slows down enough to pick up on that.
That's a wonderful point, because what you're saying, I think, is they want to know that they can impact you as well.
Yeah. And then, so intent versus outcome.
Yeah.
And so that's been a painful lesson in my teens and early 20s. So I'm not a robot anymore, for the record, for those
I can tell.
I want to slightly go out of sequence, because your story didn't start in aviation, right? It started in a closed old order Mennonite community, which makes your trajectory even more striking. You didn't learn to fly aircraft. You learned to question entire systems. And that's something that I'm curious about. How did you transition from a religious order to going into the Air Force? How did all of those things transpire? Like, was there like a domino effect of things that led you, that you can clearly go back and say, okay, this was a starting point in this, that which fed into this, which then resulted into this?
Yeah, so that I did that in my memoir, going back to what I wanted to do was to chart that path, that navigation out of an old order Mennonite community, which was a very closed, a very narrow path, particularly for women. So for your listeners who might not know, old order Mennonite is a lot like Amish, if they're familiar with that. The Amish drove horse and buggies and had electricity. We had electricity and we drove black cars, but the thinking and the sort of the culture was much the same. We couldn't go to the movies, we couldn't have a television, we couldn't wear makeup, couldn't wear jewelry. And back then, women weren't in the military for the most part, but men, if they were drafted, were declared as conscientious objectors. So we're pacifists. So totally different world. And for me, I would not be sitting where I am here today if I hadn't had a traumatic event happen when I was a child. My father got excommunicated and he was shunned. And he took his story to the newspapers, which made national headlines for the better part of a decade. He was on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, People magazine. He was Canadian television and news. So it was a searing experience. Our family was kind of thrust into the media. It was just you're in this very small world, and then suddenly everybody thinks they knows your life. And my father became violent as well. And so for me, very early on, there was this, I would have grown up to have a life just like my mother's. I would have worn the bonnet and the garb and all that. But seeing the disparity between what that culture promised and my father's behavior, and without going into it in a great deal of detail, was domestic violence and the taking money away and taking food away and card, things like that. And so for me, by the time I was in sixth grade, I was like, this happened when I was in second grade. By the time I was in sixth grade, I made the decision that I was going to make my own money. I had no idea how I was going to do it. I just knew I was going to. And then from there, each year, from each year, one thing happened, another thing happened, and that's a longer story. But that was kind of the turning point, that decision. And then there were some synchronicities and some unusual things that happened, and the path opened up, and it was to the military. It was to the Air Force Academy. So does that answer your question of?
It does. It does. I guess it does, because I wanted to lead into agency, and I felt that would have been a proper segue into agency, because you often say that clarity restores agency, and that's something that I wanted you to walk us through.
Clarity is the first step. So agency happens when you walk under your own power, you make your own choices, and it's self-leadership, basically. And clarity is the first of what I think of as three main elements of agency. You can't really have agency if you don't have clarity. And you gain more agency by developing clarity. Clarity's a skill, it's a process, it's definitely something you can develop. But clarity can also be taken away from you. Clarity is taken away from you if someone lies to you. You don't have enough information to make a full choice. If they're not transparent, if they manipulate, your agency can be taken away physically by someone drugging you or holding you captive. And it can be taken away from you by indoctrination, which is what I grew up in, right? We didn't, as a woman and as a girl growing up in that, you had one choice, which was to grow up and be a wife and a mother and the silent, submissive, obedient. That was your identity. So you didn't really have a choice, but it was framed as a choice. So your agency is taken away. So clarity is probably one of the most important things, and then everything else follows from that. And so I spent a lot of years, what I describe as a lot of years, working things out, seeing the discrepancies, seeing where things didn't add up, and in that getting clarity. And that was central.
So you said something powerful, the environment always wins, right? So how, should people think about the environments in their own lives? Because for you personally, you had the environment of navigating in aviation, but also navigating your real life, like, whether it is navigating your upbringing or navigating the culture of the Air Force, at that time, you were navigating multiple environments. So how does the environment always win?
So the environment always wins so long as it's invisible to you. So many of us, if we grow up in an environment, we're not aware of it. It's like a fish swimming in the ocean. It just is what it is. And we don't pay much attention to it. And we don't think we have a choice. Like, it's been that way for centuries, or this is what we do in our family, or this is what God says to do, or whatever the environment says, we don't question it. So the second half of that statement, the environment always wins, is the environment always wins until you become conscious of the environment. And then you gain agency. So in aviation, the way that works is you become conscious of the fact that a system could break, right? And you prepare for that. You notice the weather. You fly around the weather, or you change your flight path based upon the winds or turbulence or that sort of thing. You pay attention to the state of your fellow crew members. How's this person doing today? Maybe they're having such a hard time in life that they don't necessarily recognize that they're off. They're not up to their usual standards. And like, hey, is everything going all right? So, you check on your crew members, right? And they check on you. And when you identify it, then you can do something different. Then you have choices. So the environment always wins until you become aware of the environment.
So how does the clarity help someone stop forcing and start navigating? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. How does clarity stop someone from forcing? And so that's a really deep kind of clarity around how things operate. And I think it has to do with understanding the environment, but also understanding yourself. So if you're trying to make something happen that is, I'll give an easy example. I can't sing on tune. I couldn't sing on tune if my life depended upon it. My husband will tell you that. So if I were trying to force something, clarity is, yeah, sweetheart, you weren't born a singer, right? If I were trying to force something, I would either think that, hey, if I just practiced enough, or if I wanted this bad enough, or if I do enough mantras, or if I wish it hard enough, it might happen, right? But if I am in touch with the reality of myself, or it could be the reality of an environment, like the environment that I'm speaking into can't hear the information that I have at this time. It might
Mhm.
happen later. So that's what I would say about clarity. It has to do with, looking at the whole context and not forcing. And not forcing is different than not taking initiative, not doing what you can do.
And so does that require a person to have the full map? Do you have to have the full map in order to have clarity?
You will never have the full map. You will never have the full map. And that's part of the clarity, is that I shouldn't say you'll never have the full map, but you will have what you need in the moment. I had a mentor that said guidance always comes in advance of need, but sometimes it comes right before. Sometimes it comes 20 years before. I've had guidance that I was like, I don't know what this is for, but it's pretty clear the level of vibration or integrity of it. I was like, write this down. And then
Mhm.
I have one piece that I literally wrote it down, and it took me 20 years. I was like, oh, that's what that was for. So you will never get the map. You get the map. You'll never. You won't get the map until like the until you need it. So you may have something that changes your life and it breaks down your life and it's a painful experience. When you make a decision to leave, to say no more of that, I'm going to go in a different direction, you will get some sort of clarity in a general sense of what do you want. So back to the example when I was in 6th grade and I said, I will make my own money. I had no idea how to do it. And luckily in 6th grade, you don't think you should know how to do that, right? So I just kept going along and I was like, well, that's what I know what I want. And I'm going to keep looking for things on the path that would lead me toward a way in which I could be financially independent as a woman, right? And
Mhm.
this was in the 70s. So it wasn't as common as it is today. And then that leads to one thing. I call it a trail of breadcrumbs. Clarity in terms of getting the map comes in a trail of breadcrumbs. You follow that breadcrumb. You follow whatever guidance seems to be on your path, seems to be leading in that direction. And then you follow another one and you learn from it and you follow another one, you follow another one. And eventually what happens is that you'll look back and you'll see how it all lined up, but you weren't given that to begin with.
You know,
I don't know that
something
anybody is.
something I found interesting in terms of from a pattern recognition standpoint, and I'm going to pair it with emotions, and because it's emotions, I could be wrong, and I'm okay with that. What was your I guess your true north or your compass in this? Because it almost feels like there is like things are happening in a way. It's almost as if you're being, pointed in the right direction. For example, you knew that you needed financial independence, right? Like that's something that's guiding you because you're able to reference, oh, this is what my mother had to endure, and so you have a base point, and that is high emotional intelligence. And so your environments taught you things, and you were able to use that your environment in a way. Again, these are my emotions,
Mhm.
um, that you were able to use your emotions and the environment in conjunction with each other as a guidance. And so the fact that you went into aviation in which there is this compass, emotional compass, or and quite literally a real compass as well, that is there. It's almost as if you were destined to be where you are because you were already reading how to navigate all along.
Yes. So I discovered much, much later in life a book called The Soul's Code by the famous psychologist James Hillman. And he talks about the acorn theory. And he says that the acorn underneath its cap carries all of the instructions for what it will one day become, the mighty oak. And he shows figures throughout history that the way in which they got guidance or the way in which their path, they already had all the instructions inside them. And I was like, that makes so much sense. Like everything came together for me in that moment. And it's every person now, and every person has those instructions inside them for what they will one day become. The pansy doesn't try to be a cotton plant. The petunia doesn't try to be an oak tree. They are what they are, and they each have intrinsic value. And importantly, they each have a gift to offer the community. And if we could, I didn't know that then, but I was following something which I call the call of the wild. So I can hear when it's time to move. I can feel when it's time to do something different or to stop or to wait. Waiting's not easy for me. So that one's difficult. But
I can relate.
Right? But I can feel that, and I listen to it. I don't obey blindly, but I do give it a great deal of weight. And then I do all of the other practical, the math and the logic and all of that stuff. But so if how would our lives be different if from an early age we understood we carried all of the instructions within us, that there was something in us that was asking to be bloomed. There was a life that was asking to be lived. Doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. It doesn't have anything to do with being famous or grand or whatever. It is something new that's asking to be that's asking to be lived, that's asking to bloom, and that has a gift. That has a gift not just for you, but for your community around you. And you don't have to force it. The petunia isn't trying to be liked. It's not trying to get followers. It's just beautiful, right? And it's beautiful in a way that's different than the rose. And so, yes, I think that lies within each one of us. I think each of us is called to something. And then if we can pay attention to those signs and the signposts on the way and the nudges and the hints. And one thing I wanted to back up and say about clarity is that we often think about clarity. I think that the default with clarity is to think about it in a positive sense, right? But we can get an enormous amount of clarity and by seeing what we don't want, by negative contrast. And negative role models are really valuable as well. And we can learn from them. And sometimes we can learn as much or more than we can from positive role models. I don't want to be like that, right? Oh, there's that behavior pattern. Oh, shoot, I do that. That's how that looks, right? That's how that looks to other people. That's how that feels. And you're like, okay, I'm going to work on that pattern. So clarity comes both forms, by seeing what we want and also by seeing what we don't want.
There's two quote unquote mantras that I live by. And one is that when you understand yourself, you then understand your environment. That's the first one. And the second one is pain is the gatekeeper of destiny, which I translate to being, you have to just get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
And so long as you can tolerate being uncomfortable and you build that into your operating framework, that it's just the saying that I tell my team, it's just another Tuesday. And they know what that means.
Yeah.
Even if it's not Tuesday, it's just another Tuesday. Meaning that because we're alive and we're functioning and we have the ability to still make decisions, the worst thing we can do is not make a decision because it's just another Tuesday. We have to make decisions.
Right.
So that brings me to my final question to you, which is from plane to plane. To me, the story was there all along. It was kind of watching a movie come together, and then the title from plane to plane. It's like a full circle, and that is my personal interpretation. But it seemed like a full circle to me.
Yeah, it is a full circle. It is. And I wouldn't be sitting here. I say in the back of my memoir that if my father hadn't been as beastly as he was, if the pressure hadn't been as great as it was, I would have been in that life. I just know myself. I would have been a true believer. I wanted to follow the path of my ancestors, and I wanted to be a good person as that society defined it. That's where I would have been, And so I tell the story in the book how one day I was sitting down by the side of this mill race, which was a little kind of sluggish a little waterway. And I would go down there and I would sit on the side of the bank, and it was beautiful. There were frogs and there were buttercups and everything. And this one day, I was sitting down there inside and I was looking up at the sky, and I sort of got lost in a trance looking at the blue sky and the clouds, and wasn't really thinking about anything. My mind was clear. It was kind of a blank slate. And I always I trust my guidance whenever it's a blank slate and something comes in. And I'm sitting there just looking at the clouds and just in wonder. And I hear a voice that says, "You will have a bigger life." And I literally look behind me into the woods, into the trees. I'm like, who's there? Like, I was really far from my house and I was a little kid. And so I was kind of afraid. I was like, where did that voice come from? Right. And then I got really indignant. I was like, I don't want a bigger life. Like, this is a perfect life. Right. But so, yes, I think that destiny lies in us. And for me, part of that destiny is showing people how they can decondition from their environments, and so that they can make choices that are their own, that belong to them, that they didn't inherit, that they weren't indoctrinated into without their full awareness. And then you choose what's best for you, what works for you.
I think something that people can take away from your story is that clarity isn't just necessary in the cockpit, because there's consequence if clarity is not on your side. But clarity is necessary in life, because everything that we do affect us, but it also affects those around us. And I think that we oftentimes don't pay attention to the tiny details, because those details matter. Whether it's your 3-year-old saying that, "I just want to come give you a hug or a kiss." Well, it's important. Those small details matter. There's a reason why, and we don't know the reason why. And so you have to be able to just slow down. And as the kids say, there's this term called locked in now that I'm still trying to decipher, but I think it means to be in tune and be connected. And so I think with your work, a lot of people will learn how to get locked in. And I have a great appreciation for everything that is to come. And I look forward to dissecting from plane to plane. I think that's going to be an intellectual treat for myself.
I would love that.
So
Yeah, and clarity is a trailblazer for other people too. They're like, "Oh, I
Mhm.
can do that."
Yeah.
So yeah.
And this will be my final thought. Something that I've learned, and I learned this through wrestling. When I became the captain of the wrestling team, I did not want to be the captain of the wrestling team. I never wanted to be captain of anything that I did, because it just meant more work. That's how I looked at it, right? So whether it was soccer, track, weightlifting, wrestling, I never wanted it. I never wanted it, because I always felt, oh, these guys always have to do more work. Can I just perform be the best, and just go home. That's what I wanted.
Right.
Then my wrestling coach made me go running, and I didn't understand why I was running. I finished first, and that was the thing. If you finish first, you got to go home early, right? So I finished first,
That's
and then
locked
he
in.
yeah, he made me go again. And so I did, and I said, "All right, I'm done." And then he made me go again, and then he made me go again. And I knew better than to say anything or complain because there'd be more. So I hid my emotions and how angry I was because it was at the point at which it would show.
Mm.
And he then was like, "Hey, you know what? We're gonna wrestle. We're gonna go wrestle. We're gonna go wrestle the entire team." And so I wrestled everyone in the wrestling room. Then I had to go wrestle him, which I absolutely got demolished. Then he made me wrestle everyone again. That's
He had a
it,
point. Some kind of point he was trying to make clearly.
yes. And he said to me that you don't get to choose like who you impact. That was the point. It was that when I say that I don't want to do some things, everyone else, whether they're the freshman or the sophomore, well, now I created a culture where they'll get to where I am at, and they're gonna say, "Well, I don't wanna do that either."
Right.
Because that was the mistake. That was the culture the seed that I was planting. And because others were listening to what I was saying, my decisions weren't just my own, I was affecting everyone else. And so there's other parts of your work that it brought up those emotions and those core memories
Mm.
where like your quote was, I believe, and correct me if I'm misquoting, that masculinity isn't the problem. It's maturity.
That's
Was it?
correct. That's
Okay.
correct.
And so that was something that it brought that back because that is a hyper masculine sport. And the maturity of saying my decisions affect other people, it now takes me into leadership. I have a duty as a leader to make sure that I get things right and that the culture that I perpetuate is that is sustainable and healthy, and that I'm not creating something that is toxic. And that is very much the case. I am still masculine, but at the same time, I have emotional intelligence and understanding because of my experiences that my wrestling coach painfully taught me. But I learned that day. I learned
And you
that
never forgot that.
no,
That
but
I'm gonna remember that. That's awesome. You don't get to decide who you impact.
yes. And so your work to me is you do your thing. You were living your life, Miss Patty. You were living your life. And somewhere along the line, your life now gets to impact other people. And I think that is such a beautiful story in itself. So I just wanted to truly just thank you for that. And to you brought up those core memories that I will now it's like, I feel this level of revitalization, and I feel rejuvenated because of it.
Well, I love that, and thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna write that down. It's
Yeah, you don't.
powerful. It's powerful.
Yes, and yeah, I never choose who I get to. And the other part of that was you also don't get to choose if you're someone else's hero or villain.
That's true, right?
Right? That this is my wrestling coach that said these things to me, and when you're a kid that didn't wrestle before and you're seeing other people wrestle and compete, you don't think of yourself because you're not on TV necessarily, right? That, oh, like that middle schooler is looking up to me, and to them, I may be their superhero. Not that that is something that I was cognitively thinking about, but now I get it now, especially because I'm a parent. And whenever I work out at home, which I don't like to, if I'm lifting weights, my son and my daughter, they pull chairs and they clap when I'm up. They say, "You're so strong, you could pick up the house." And
Uh,
that's when it clicked that I remember as a kid wanting to be a superhero, and in their eyes, I am the superhero, right? So I do get to be the superhero because being a superhero is an idea. And Superman, Wonder Woman, they can pick up buildings, they can throw trains, and our impact on the generation behind us is that we are the superheroes and we do make an impact,
Yep.
or we are the villains. And so I'm very grateful for your work.
Thank you.
If someone listening feels between worlds, the old story doesn't fit, the new one isn't clear, what is the first step toward clarity that doesn't require having the full map? Because in aviation, certainty rarely exists. You move forward with the clearest available understanding. What makes this conversation powerful isn't just aviation, it's the discipline behind it. Because clarity in the cockpit isn't optional. It's the difference between drifting and navigating, between reacting and deciding, between confusion and agency. And what Patty shows is that the same principles apply to life. You don't need certainty. You need clarity. The ability to see reality as it is, separate signal from noise, and move forward with grounded decisions. After 30 years in high-stakes environments, that's the lesson she brings back. Clarity is not a feeling. It's a skill. And for anyone listening who feels between worlds, questioning old assumptions, or navigating uncertainty, that skill may be the one that changes everything. This is the Magnificent Ones.
If this podcast challenged you, good. Clarity often does. The point here isn't consensus or reassurance. It's to leave you more precise than when you arrived. Keep what sharpens your thinking. Discard the rest. But don't confuse familiarity with truth. If this conversation mattered, follow the podcast and share it selectively with people who value depth and not noise. Until next time, stay disciplined with your thinking, selective with your attention, and honest about what you're really optimizing for.